Okay, today we want to talk about monopolistic competition, and we're going to get into oligopolies, how they work, etc. We've talked about monopolies, and we delved mostly into situations where the monopoly is the sole provider, has a comparative advantage, he's the lowest cost producer, and in effect, he owns the demand curve. There are other types of monopolistic competition, and that's what we're going to talk about now in Chapter 16. All right. Firms sell products in the marketplace that are similar but not exactly the same or identical. And that is monopolistic competition, the definition for monopolistic competition. So they're selling similar but not the same or identical products in the marketplace, and they have, as a result of that, a monopoly. Typical example of this type is copyrights. A book is a book that makes them a monopoly because they get what's called a copyright. Now, as they get a copyright, they've copyrighted the information that they provided in their book, whether it be a text or a novel, etc. Now, the problem is where the situation comes in where people compete monopolistically because, for instance, in your case of your textbook, as we mentioned, your textbook has several different authors who produce a textbook on microeconomics. So, but each one of those, assuming they copyright their work, has a monopoly on that particular book. No one else can produce the same book. Now, the same is also true in the movie business and in the entertainment business. Movies have copyrights on the subject matter. The actors, directors, screenwriters, etc., all get protected under copyright laws when they copyright a movie that they have produced, so that no one else can produce the same movie. Now, if they want to go on and do, let's say, a sequel, that's different. That's a new movie. So monopoly versus competition. Let's take a look at it. This is a graph that shows you the difference between monopolistic competition and a completely competitive situation. And as you can see, the competitive situation is such, all the way on the right, figure B, is such that the price is fixed. Many buyers, many sellers, and sellers can move in and out of that marketplace at will. And the point at which is their sweet spot, and the volume is where the marginal cost and the price curve intersect. The marginal cost at that point is equal to average total cost, and it's also equal to the price. Now, if we move back to the left, we'll see what a monopolist does, a monopolistic competition. He doesn't have to produce at what we call the equilibrium. He can produce a smaller quantity where his marginal revenue intersects his marginal cost, but the price he sells at is greater than the intersection of the marginal revenue and marginal cost. So therefore, on the demand curve, he puts a price, restricts the quantity available, and gets a higher price. And in that way, that whole triangle, as we talked about in the last chapter, is what is called monopolistic profit, or profit over and above that equilibrium point. So monopoly profit, let's talk about it. Here's what it looks like. You see on this curve where he's not producing, where marginal cost and the demand curve intersect, that's not the quantities he's offering to the marketplace. What he does is he produces at his lowest average total cost, where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, but the demand curve is higher, which means that at a lower quantity, he can produce a higher price or demand a higher price. So the difference between the average total cost curve and the demand curve, or the price he can sell it at, is the revenue or the monopolistic profit that he gains from being in a situation where he is a monopolistically competitive firm. Monopoly loss, much the same. If they don't understand, the monopolist doesn't understand his costs, he could put himself in a situation where the demand curve for the product is below the average total cost of the product to produce it. In other words, marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect, but the demand curve is allowing a price that's less than his average total cost. So therefore, he produces at a loss. Now, obviously, a monopolist would do everything in his power to reduce that average total cost, and get his cost down so that he can be back into a profitable, even a monopolistic profit situation. So what's a monopoly? Is the NFL a monopoly? Let's talk about that. To play in the NFL, you have to abide by the rules they set down for teams and players, particularly salary caps. We've seen a lot of controversy lately in terms of football players not standing and respecting the national anthem or the flag. In the rules for the NFL, it says that the players should be on the field for the playing of the national anthem and standing. Okay, so I think what happened was the guy who's the head of it, Roger Goodell, tends to be not necessarily a stronger person than he should be. I don't think, personal opinion. Pete Rozelle was much stronger than this guy is, and as you know, there's a big controversy going on now. The president and the owner of the Dallas Cowboys has said Roger Goodell wants $44 million in a contract. He wants health care for life. He wants all kinds of things. And I guess Jerry Jones doesn't think he's done a good job. And as a result, he's fighting this kind of salary increase or contract for Roger Goodell. And he's at odds probably with most of the owners of the different teams. But anyway, we'll see what happens. All right, so another reason or thing that might indicate it is a monopoly is that there's no cap on ticket prices. It's almost like a monopoly in that they have been able to demand higher and higher ticket prices. Try to buy a ticket, a season ticket, for instance, to the Dallas Cowboys. Very, very expensive. Prices have gone through the roof. And that's true of all of the teams in the NFL. The other thing they do, which tends to be kind of monopolistic, is they share revenue. In other words, areas that don't have the supply of ticket buyers that, say, Dallas does, or what other team? I guess Kansas City. There are several teams in the NFL that do very well every year, and they pack their stadiums. There are other teams that don't do as well. Detroit Lions, for instance, comes to mind. The San Diego Chargers right now are not doing very well. They're now the Los Angeles Chargers, but they're not doing very well. They're playing in a stadium that only seats about 30,000 in Compton, California. So what's happening is they're protecting all the teams in the NFL by engaging in revenue sharing. Even though you didn't sell as many tickets or make as much money as I did, I'm going to give you some of my money. Another indication that it might be a monopoly is the annual draft, okay, where teams bid on college players coming out of college in their senior year, sometimes their junior year. I guess they can't bid on someone unless they're a junior, coming out of the junior year, going into the senior year, if the player elects to go into the NFL and not finish his senior year. So the annual draft means you have to draft, and your draft is determined by the NFL. And in other words, the NFL is having a lot to say on how the business of the individual teams and the individual team owners are run. So the question is it a monopoly? So I think in class next week after next, we'll talk about this a little bit, and I'm interested in your opinions as well. And there have been times when the Justice Department has gone after the NFL and challenged whether they are or not a monopoly. So far, the NFL has prevailed. Okay, so you look at all the things that I just listed here and have to ask the question, are these things a restraint of trade? And should they fall under antitrust enforcement rules? We talked about AT&T and their situation. They had the breakup. Now AT&T, the new AT&T, is trying to buy um, Time Warner Cable. They already have Dish Network, so they have, in terms of communication, they have a cable company. No, I'm sorry, a satellite company. They have a telephony company, which with all the copper that's on the poles and in the ground. And now they want a cable company, which is the Time Warner product or Time Warner company. The Justice Department is viewing this as a restraint of trade because they're saying that this is vertical integration. And I believe what's going to happen is, as this all shakes out, is that the lawyers for AT&T are going to argue that it is not vertical integration, but it is horizontal integration. In other words, all we're doing is buying additional companies, and it's a horizontal integration. It's not vertical. All these three entities that we have, AT&T, including the cell phone business, Time Warner, which they hope to acquire, and Dish Network, are all different entities and different businesses, and they're not, even though they're in the communication business, AT&T will argue that they're not vertically integration. We're not engaging in vertical integration. We're just buying a parallel type of company. So it'll be interesting. We'll follow it and see what happens. Okay, another question that's always come up. Amway or other multi-level marketing firms, are they monopolies? This has been challenged a couple of times, particularly by the courts. And I believe Amway has always kind of prevailed. And if you're not familiar with what multi-level marketing is, you'll recruit someone in Amway, and that person will be responsible for selling product, and that person will also recruit other people under that person. Now, what happens in a case like this is that hang on a second. What happens in a case like this is that Amway argued that these are all independent business people. They have their own individual businesses. We don't tell them what to do. We tell them what products they can sell and what they can't sell. We don't tell them how to do it. We don't tell them who to recruit, etc. So they've avoided the idea or the concept that multi-level marketing is not integration, vertical integration. It's just a sales methodology of recruiting salespeople through independent business people. So it's an interesting concept. They've been able to avoid the problems of monopolies because of how they're viewed. All right, next, chapter 17, we talk about oligopoly. An oligopoly is essentially not one firm, not a single firm, but several firms that are in the same industry that cooperate. They cooperate on prices, quantities, etc. In other words, they divide up the market so that nobody gets hurt. Now, there are few sellers in an oligopolistic market. They collude on prices and therefore the marketplace for their products. Okay, they're independent companies, but they engage in what's called collusion. Sometimes it's overt, sometimes it's covert. But essentially what they're doing is they're taking a market and carving it up carving up amongst themselves, setting prices that they all benefit from. And in it, essentially, they're ignoring the point of equilibrium, like a monopoly, and they're acting together as a group, like a monopoly. So it's two or three firms working together and acting just like a monopoly through collusion and cooperation amongst themselves. Now, some examples of oligopolies might be, for instance, tennis balls. There are probably only 2 or 3 tennis ball manufacturers in the US. Dunlop would be one of them. I can't think of any of the others. Cigarettes might also be an oligopoly. Golf balls might be an oligopoly. In other words, the price of golf balls, how they're set, how you manufacture them, the quality standards they all have to meet. These guys kind of work together. Another example might be cartels, a cartel that controls oil, OPEC, for instance. The OPEC members attempt to control the supply, and by controlling the supply, they control the price. I tried to. Coffee, at one time, coffee was considered an oligopoly because they came up and began what's called a cartel, the coffee cartel, mainly driven by the efforts of Brazil. I think now there are more and more players in the coffee business, so it's probably more difficult to enforce cartel type prices and operations because there are so many more countries now producing coffee besides Brazil. Brazil was the standard. We now get coffee from Colombia, from Africa, from the Middle East. It's kind of all over the place. And you know, one of the things that goes on in OPEC's and in the coffee cartel, for instance, it's very, very difficult to get everybody to collude because there are so many players. Okay, and it's maybe an example of collusion and it may be an example of an oligopoly, but there are a lot of different players in the OPEC, for instance, in the OPEC realm. They include not only the Arab countries, but also Russia. They get oil out of the North Sea as well. Venezuela, which has had a whole bunch of conflicts of its own. It's very, very difficult to get people to work together. Iran, for instance, just got the rights, or with the lifting of the embargo on Iran, they're able to export more oil. It's essential that they do export more oil to get the country back on a solid footing after the lifting of the oil embargo from the nuclear pact. Anyway, those are kind of examples of what we're talking about with an oligopoly. Now, how do they get away with it? Antitrust laws make it illegal for firms to collude or to fix prices in private. The key word here is private, okay? If, for instance, they get together, the CEOs, in a collusionary manner, they have a meeting, and there are only 3 or 4 firms involved, and they go off to Palm Springs or some other resort area, and they get together and decide for the coming year who's going to produce how much, and what prices they're going to charge. Okay? And it's called collusion. Now, under the antitrust laws in the United States and the Department of Justice, collusion is against the law. However, the price is being fixed, and the way they get around it is they discuss it openly in public. And because they do it openly and in the public, there is no violation of the antitrust laws. So there's a lot of subtleties in an oligopolistic situation, which says that these guys each know what the other's doing because they make public announcements. I'm going to raise prices 25% next year. Okay, this oligopolist firm, one of 3, for instance, that makes that announcement, public announcement. Guess what? The other 2 guys hear it, and as a result, they all raise their prices 3% next year, or whatever the number may be. All right, Nash equilibrium. This is the guy who, if you saw the movie A Beautiful Mind, came to the conclusion and put the Nash equilibrium out as a kind of an explanation of what happens. And what Nash came up with was, he said, you know, collusion is easy in this type of environment because they are open in all of their actions, their strategies, their prices, what they're doing, what they're developing, etc. It's all wide open, and it's there Well, for everybody to see. And if you think about it, the government, the SEC, requires everyone to file a 10K, and it tells everything about the company. Well, that's kind of disclosing a lot of stuff to your competitors. And if you decide to sit down with a competitor and we're going to work together, we're going to set up the same strategy, we're going to carve up this market, we're all going to make money and be happy, you know what? That's what happens in the real world. And that's how they get around the antitrust laws. Now, there is such a thing, however, as collusion that is sanctioned by the government. And it happened in September of 2008 when the financial crisis hit the marketplace, and the financial institutions and the brokers and the Wall Street people and Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the Congress, etc. So what happened was 3 guys were chartered by President Bush to find a way to fix the problem. We had a tremendous liquidity problem. People who had bought these investments, they were supposedly insured. Well, they were insured, but they were all scrambling to get the money back, and it was a run essentially on the Wall Street firms and the investment banks and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. As a result, Bush appointed 3 people as a team to find a way to fix this problem. The guy on the left with the bald head, totally bald head, is Hank Paulson. He was Bush's Secretary of Treasury in 2008. The guy in the middle with the beard is Ben Bernanke. Bernanke was chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time. And the guy all the way on the right, the young guy with all the hair, he's the guy who was president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And a lot of people have said he should have known what was going on and what was going to happen. So what they decided to do is, with the blessing of President Bush, they called everybody together, 7 o'clock Friday night, September 12th, for a meeting. And it was a meeting of all the prominent CEOs in the Wall Street, in the financial industry. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, John Mack, CEO of Morgan Stanley, Lloyd Bankenfein, Goldman Sachs, Vikram Pandit, Citicorp, John Thain, Merrill Lynch, Brady Dugan, Credit Suisse, Robert Kelly, Bank of New York Mellon. Okay, so these guys were all called to New York, 7 o'clock Friday night, September 12th. From the government side, in this meeting, again, this is a meeting in closed doors, closed session. The government side, the meeting included Paulson, who was the Secretary of Treasury, Timothy Geithner, who was the President of the Federal Reserve, and Cox, who was the Chairman of the Securities Exchange Commission. Ben Bernanke stayed in Washington and coordinated from Washington anything that needed to be discussed with the Congress, the President, etc. So Geithner tasked all the individuals in the room to come up with a plan to save Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers had gotten itself in too deep in these credit default swaps, which, as we discussed earlier, were tranches or derivatives, and they were created with mortgages underneath them, and the value of the tranche of the derivative was based on what the mortgages did or how they performed. And as we discussed earlier, the concept is great when all the mortgages are good, solid mortgages, 20% down, 80% loan to value, okay, and 30 to 15 years. But what happened was the subprime lenders got in there with their 1, 5, and 7-year loans, little or no qualification requirements, and as a result, it polluted these investments. Okay, when the market started to fall, crash, the bubble burst in the housing market, this all came home to roost. Now, Lehman Brothers, unfortunately, was in a bad situation because they were exposed tremendously. The CEO of Lehman Brothers, Dick Fuld, didn't really understand what was happening in his own company. Okay. Morgan Stanley, by the way, several months before this, had fallen into trouble. and was purchased by, I think, J.P. Morgan for about $2 a share. So Dick Fuld, Lehman Brothers, saw the handwriting on the wall. He probably didn't understand it any more than anybody else did, but the guys that understood it were Hank Paulson and Timothy Geithner. And so what they said was, gentlemen, if we don't do something, Lehman Brothers is going to have to file bankruptcy. Now, that will be, if that occurs, that will be the biggest bankruptcy in history. There were 60,000 people worldwide that worked for Lehman Brothers. So Geithner's exact words to all of these guys, these power brokers in this room was, come back in the morning and prepare to do something. So here's the thing. You've got to think about this. These guys who are Wall Street brokers and investment bankers are being told by the government that they have to find a way to save a competitor. They have to use their own money, their own influence, their own people to try to save a competitor, Lehman Brothers. Absolutely unheard of before. Number one, we've never seen a collusion to this up to this magnitude. And number two, the idea of forcing these investment bankers to come back with a plan to buy a competitor, to save a competitor, and keep that competitor in business, competing with them. Absolutely unheard of. So what comes up Saturday night, the next day, September 13th, 2008, at the New York Fed, the bankers came back with a proposal. And Barclays Bank, which is a UK bank, had a big operation in the US, would be part of the carve up of what would happen. They would take some of the bad real estate loans, the government would take some of them, and some private equity people would take other parts of it. In exchange, Lehman Brothers would give those people who were putting up the money common and preferred stock in their company. So here you have the competitors in an industry buying stock in a competitor's company, and all sanctioned by the federal government. So they would what they decided to do was provide a special purpose vehicle of $37 billion to cover the $52 billion that Lehman had on his books. And that $52 billion was really worth somewhere between $27 and $30 billion. We're talking big bucks here. Sunday, September 14th, 2008, they came up with a term sheet. In the world of business, a term sheet is actually a proposal. What they're going to do, how it's going to be done, how it's going to be structured, who's going to pay what, etc. So a term sheet is really a proposal. So the agreement, they were going to provide $30 billion amongst themselves to save their rival and spread the risk across the industry. So they're prepared to bail out Lehman Brothers with $30 billion of their own money to save a competitor. Sunday night, the British government informs Hank Paulson this deal can't go through in time. Even though Barclays has agreed to do it, the deal can't go through because Barclays is a UK bank. And because it is a UK bank, the Barclays shareholders will have to approve this acquisition. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is like the Secretary of Treasury in the US, will also have to approve the transaction. And the bottom line was the British government did not want any part of the US problem. Now that one's a beaut, because the British government has its own problems in spades and would have a real estate bubble burst as well. So the deal couldn't go through. That was Sunday night. So Paulson tells Chris Cox of the Securities and Exchange Commission to call the Lehman Brothers board and put them on notice. They have to file bankruptcy on Monday morning. These are dark, dark days. Lehman files bankruptcy, the biggest bankruptcy in U.S. history. I'm sorry, went a little bit too fast. I'll talk about this more. So you have to recognize at this point, this is the middle of September. The weekend, the 15th, is coming up on Monday. Um, and the government at this point had said, no money, no bailout. You guys are going to have to solve this problem yourself. Hank Paulson was out there with Cox and with Geithner, and they had no backing from the federal government to pull us together. So their only option was to try to get one of the banks, like Barclays Bank, to buy Lehman Brothers and to bail Lehman Brothers out. It was their only choice. Before that week was over, however, the Congress would allocate $700 billion to Paulson, Geithner, and Bernanke to fix the financial problem in the US. So the government was completely out of it at this stage, but after the shock waves of the bankruptcy for Lehman Brothers hit the US Congress and other countries around the world, they knew that they had to step in and do something to save the financial structure and the financial institutions of the world. Not just New York, not just the US. Of course, the US was going to be the first to tumble. But if it did, it would have big, big shocks around the world. And nobody wanted that to happen. So by the end of the week, the Congress stepped up and put up some money to fix this problem and bail all of these guys out of these horrible mortgages. Okay, so an oligopoly, back on how this works. The key is these guys need to cooperate. So the only way an oligopoly can survive in the long run is that these guys cooperate and do not compete with one another, or how they're going to compete with one another is understood amongst all the parties. That's key. They've got to understand how we are going to compete and what prices, of course, we're going to sell, how many we're going to sell, how we're going to advertise it, etc. All of these things have to be agreed to in the oligopoly. That's a big task if you think about it. So, and each player in the oligopoly has to remain content with his role with the other oligopoly firms. That means if one firm can sell in the marketplace 20% of the products, another firm can sell 40%, and another firm can sell, I don't know, another 40%, or 30%. Are they going to be happy and content forever with that type of arrangement? In other words, they cannot increase their sales unless they increase the size of the total market. So the demand curve has to shift in order for them to improve their profitability and make money. Right? This is hard stuff to do. So you have to make sure that you all understand what you're doing, and you have to push and attempt. If you want to grow your business, you're going to have to move that demand curve and increase the demand for your products for everybody as a total. That means 20%, my 20% is worth, let's say, 100 million in sales. My 20% next year has to be worth 110 million in sales, because I've got to show Wall Street that I can grow my earnings so that my stock improves and my stockholders are happy. This is a difficult task. Diversification is one of the answers. For instance, many firms try to diversify when they're caught up in an oligopolistic situation. So they go into other businesses. It's not necessarily vertical integration that they do, but it's called horizontal integration. They go out and buy other industries. Classic example, when we moved from Detroit to California, Philip Morris owned the Mission Viejo company. It had purchased the company from the Mission Viejo company. And they were a developer. They built Mission Viejo, California, under the name of Philip Morris. So Philip Morris knew what was happening. And again, we talked about cigarettes being an oligopoly type of situation. Philip Morris knew they had to expand their business, and one of the ways they had to do it was to get into something else. They chose real estate. So they were developing both in Florida and in California. Great properties. Okay. The oil companies, if you've ever seen a BP, British Petroleum commercial lately, they talk about how they're expanding into wind and solar power. Okay, they can see that oil may be doomed in the long run because of the effects of pollution, and therefore they say they feel as though they've got to get on the bandwagon to reduce pollution and become part of the wind and solar solution. So they can maintain their oligopoly status and be happy with it in one particular industry or company, but they expand outside that area or that market or that place and continue to grow in other ways. That's how they survive. The theory we're talking about here is called the prisoner's dilemma, for instance. You've seen this strategy on TV. Two suspects of committing a crime are arrested. They put one in one questioning room and the other in the other questioning room. So they question them at length. And at some point in time, the guys who are questioning one of the prisoners leaves the room and goes into the room where the second prisoner is and said, by the way, your partner just copped out on you. He told us everything that you did, said that you're responsible. And as a result of him turning state's evidence for us, he's going to get a lighter sentence and you're going to go to jail. Now, it could be true or not true. And what happens is the prisoners both break down, the crime is solved, and one goes to jail for a longer period of time than the other. That's what's called a prisoner's dilemma. So in that way, mutual benefit breaks down. And it's a lot like an oligopoly. Okay? That's why these guys do expansion horizontally. Dominant strategy is another part of it. Assume competition exists in the oligopoly and is not regulated by some government entity. Let's make that assumption. It's extremely difficult for firms to exist in that environment because they face tremendous pressure from their shareholders who want the price of the stock to increase so they can make money. Wall Street isn't happy, and vendors are not happy. So what you have to do in an oligopolistic situation is make sure you keep pressure away from you, from the stockholders, from Wall Street, and from vendors. Okay, vendors want to sell more product, and if they're limited in selling their product because we have an oligopolistic situation, they're not going to be happy either. So firm strategy separates it from that of its position from the other firms. See, what happens in a lot of cases is that one firm ends up being the dominant firm. And if that occurs, which probably does, are the other firms that are in the oligopoly going to be content with letting that guy be the dominant force in the oligopoly? It takes a tremendous, if you think about it, it takes a tremendous amount of collusion. Antitrust policy. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed, and then it was further defined in 1914. Okay? And this grew out of what we talked about earlier, the actions of the robber barons and the growth of different companies, control of oil by Rockefeller, control of steel by Carnegie. The government saw what was happening and they knew they needed to step in because there were abuses taking place. Unemployment was occurring. So the purpose of the Clayton Act was to strengthen the Sherman Act in response to these robber barons that we talked about in the last chapter. They needed to put teeth in the law so that they could go after these companies. So they added things like restraint of trade. Okay. Now, the real question today is technology is changing a lot of things in the way things work. And is the act really geared up towards handling what's occurred technologically in the last 15, 20 years. Software-wise, does it prevent foreign entities from copying patents and copyrights? It really doesn't. And this whole area of antitrust policy has to be looked at by the federal government in light of the growth of the internet. We know what's happening to copyrights in China, for instance, where they're being recopied by Chinese companies and being resold. So it's a big problem. It really needs to be looked at in terms of today's real problems and real situations with the growth of the internet. All right, so what's happened is we've ended up, because of this is very difficult to enforce, we've ended up with some concepts that kind of go around the problem. For instance, the automobile makers send cars to their dealers, and if you look on that sticker, it says MSRP. That's the manufacturer's suggested retail price. Now, it doesn't say this is the price you have to sell it at. It says manufacturer's suggested retail price. That wording gets them around the concept of collusion or price setting. Okay, grocery stores, again, get away with the same type of thing. They need to clear their shelves of a product. The manufacturer doesn't want them to sell it for less than he says it should be sold for. And guess what happens? The grocery store needs to clear the shelf, so they go for 2 for 1. Buy one, you get the second one for half price or possibly free. Now, price competition between airlines. This is a beaut. Airlines cutting fares to compete in new markets. Give you an example. If you were to fly on American Airlines and you wanted to fly from, let's say, Seattle to California, if that same route was covered by Alaska Airlines, for instance, you would find that if there's competition at the airports, at both airports, between, let's say, Alaska and American, or let's say American and Southwest, American would price their fares to compete with those discount lenders. I think now American has Alaska as part of its partnership program, but certainly not the guys in Southwest. So if Southwest is in the airport and you don't want to fly Southwest, you can get equivalent fares from other airlines at the same airport. In Orange County, California, for instance, where Southwest have moved in, the flights from Detroit or from Dallas-Fort Worth to Orange County, Santa Ana Airport, are very, very cheap because Southwest is flying the same route from Love Field, DAL. Okay, then tying two products together. Another way of getting around it: shampoo and conditioner. You get them both together for the price of one, or maybe for 10% more. So typically what they'll do is they'll combine two products so that the whole issue of price setting is confused and not readily available. Okay, that's it for now. We'll pick up in 2 weeks, Thursday, 2 weeks. And I've also gotten your schedule for the final exams. Your final exam is going to be on your last class day, the week of the 14th. I think the last day is the 14th, so your final exam will be on that Tuesday during normal class time period. The final exam will only be approximately 120 questions, so you'll be able to finish in less than an hour, no problem at all. And I will give you your sample questions for the second grouping, and I'll do that a week before you take the final exam. We will also have time to do some talking about the questions, and I'll help you with some of the answers and go through some of the explanations for it. So in the meantime, have a great Thanksgiving. Don't eat too much turkey, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.